August 14th, 1851, Charleston, South Carolina. Thomas Rutledge grabbed Elias by the jaw, forced his face upward under the auction house torchlight, and said to the crowd with a cold smile, "Look at it. Not him, not her. It." He paid $2,847, not for labor, not for mercy, but for total possession of a human being his world could not classify. And that single act of cruelty would detonate everything he thought he owned, including his wife, his plantation, and his life. If this story moves something in your soul, subscribe to this channel right now, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happened at Belmont Plantation in 1851 is one of the darkest, strangest, and most suppressed scandals in American history. And it starts with a name. Just one name. Elias. The auction house on King Street in Charleston smelled like sawdust and sweat and something else nobody wanted to name. It was the smell of human beings being reduced to numbers, to weights and measurements, to profit margins written in ink that never fully dried. On the morning of August 14th, 1851, Thomas Rutledge arrived before the doors even opened. He was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked permanently impatient, like the world was always moving too slowly for him. He owned 700 acres of tobacco land in Prince Edward County, Virginia, a plantation called Belmont that had been in his family for 2 generations. He had money. He had status. He had a wife and a household full of enslaved people who feared him in the quiet, careful way that people fear something they cannot escape. But Thomas Rutledge had not come to Charleston for labor. He had come because a broker named Silas Hadworth had sent him a private letter 3 weeks earlier. That letter described, in careful, almost clinical language, an enslaved person of approximately 19 years of age with what Hadworth called a condition of rare physical complexity. He used the Latin term. He mentioned that several physicians had already examined the individual and confirmed the findings. He said, and Thomas would remember this line for the rest of his short life, that the specimen represented a biological curiosity unlike anything currently documented in the southern states. Thomas had read that letter 4 times. Then he burned it. Then he wrote back and said he would be there. The bidding started at $800. Thomas Rutledge did not flinch when it climbed past $1,200. He barely breathed when it crossed $2,000. When the final hammer came down at $2,847, the room went quiet. In that particular way rooms go quiet when someone has done something that everyone understands, but no one will say out loud. The person who had just been purchased stood at the edge of the block and did not cry, did not tremble. Just looked at Thomas Rutledge with eyes that were dark and still, and measured him the way a person measures something they already know they cannot trust. That was the first moment Thomas felt it, that strange, crawling discomfort. He dismissed it immediately. He was a planter. This was property. The transaction was complete. He told himself that all the way back to Virginia. The wagon ride from the nearest rail station to Belmont Plantation took 4 hours. Thomas sat in the front. Elias Carter, which was the name written in the bill of sale, sat in the back with a thin blanket and no conversation. One of Thomas's overseers, a man named Cully, drove the horses and kept glancing back over his shoulder with an expression he was clearly trying to control. Finally, Cully said, low enough that he thought it wouldn't carry, "That thing ain't natural, Mr. Rutledge." Thomas said, "That thing is worth more than your entire family's combined income for the next decade. So I suggest you drive and keep your opinions to yourself." Cully drove, but he did not stop glancing back. When the wagon finally pulled through the iron gates of Belmont, The sun was beginning to drop. The enslaved workers who were finishing the evening chores stopped what they were doing. Not dramatically, not all at once, just one by one, the way people stop moving when something changes in the air and they cannot explain why. An older woman named Hattie, who had worked the Rutledge kitchen for 30 years, later told her granddaughter that the moment Elias stepped off that wagon, she felt something shift. Not good or bad, just different. Like weather changing before the clouds even show up. Elias stood in the yard and looked at the main house. 2 stories, white columns, tall windows that caught the last light of the evening like mirrors. Elias had been in plantation houses before, had been traded twice already, had learned that the bigger the house, the more dangerous the interior. Thomas Rutledge came around the wagon and stood close. Too close. "You will not be going to the quarters," he said quietly. "You will be assigned a room in the east wing of the main house. You will be available for my study and observation at the hours I specify. You will not speak to the field workers. You will not discuss your situation with anyone in this household." Elias looked at him steadily. "And if someone speaks to me first?" Thomas blinked. It was such a direct question, such a calm, unafraid question. He had expected silence. He had expected the particular blankness that people forced into slavery sometimes wore like armor. "Then you will redirect the conversation," Thomas said, "or you will come to me directly and report it." Elias said nothing more, just nodded once. But the look in those dark eyes stayed with Thomas all through dinner that evening. He picked at his food and told his wife Margaret that he had acquired a new household assistant. Margaret asked the price. He told her. She put her fork down. "Thomas, that is nearly $3,000. "It is an investment." "In what, exactly?" He looked at her from across the long dining table and said, "In knowledge." Margaret Rutledge was 38 years old and had been married to Thomas for 16 years. She had learned through those 16 years that when her husband said knowledge, he usually meant control. She had also learned that pushing back directly never worked. So she said nothing more that evening. She simply filed the information away in the careful, practiced way that intelligent women in difficult marriages learned to file things. 3 days passed. During those 3 days, Elias was kept almost entirely in a room on the east side of the house that Thomas had cleared out and set up with a desk, 2 chairs, a wash basin, and a narrow bed. Books were brought in. Thomas visited twice a day, sometimes 3 times. He carried a leather notebook, and he wrote in it continuously while asking questions that Elias answered carefully, offering just enough to satisfy without revealing anything essential. On the 4th day, Margaret Rutledge appeared at the east wing door. She told herself she was checking on the household, making sure the room was being maintained properly, making sure the new arrival was not causing disruption to the domestic routine. These were reasonable things for a plantation mistress to check on, entirely reasonable. She knocked once and opened the door. Elias was sitting at the small desk, reading, a book that Thomas had not given permission for, as it turned out, because it was one from the main library. Margaret recognized it immediately. It was a volume of botanical illustrations that she herself had ordered from Philadelphia 2 years prior. She should have felt anger, proprietorial offense. Instead, she heard herself say, "Do you enjoy natural science?" Elias looked up. There was that steadiness again, that quality of complete, undisturbed attention that made people feel simultaneously seen and unsettled. "I enjoy accuracy," Elias said. "Plants do not pretend to be what they are not. Their structures are what they are, no more, no less." Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment longer than she intended. Then she said, "That is a rather philosophical observation for someone reading a book about root systems." "Most philosophical observations come from simple things," Elias replied. Margaret returned the next day, and the day after that. She told herself each time that she was supervising, that she had every right to understand what her husband was doing in this East Wing with a person he had paid an obscene amount of money for. She told herself she was being vigilant, protective of the household. But what she could not explain, what she could not press flat and file away the way she did with other uncomfortable truths, was the feeling she had in that East Wing room. It was the feeling of being in the presence of someone who had been so thoroughly reduced by the world around them that they had turned entirely inward and found something there that the world could not touch. She could not name what that something was. She just knew she wanted to understand it. Meanwhile, Thomas's notebooks were filling up rapidly. He wrote about physiology with the detached precision of a man who believed he was doing science. He wrote about identity and nature and what he called the boundaries of the human form. He wrote about Elias the way a collector writes about a rare artifact, with reverence and ownership in equal measure. He did not write about the conversations, because the conversations were beginning to disturb him. Because Elias, despite being legally property, despite being in a room at the sufferance of a man who could do whatever he chose, had a way of asking questions in response to questions that left Thomas feeling like the one being studied, like the one whose life was being recorded in careful, invisible notes. One evening, Thomas sat down across from Elias and said, "Tell me what you believe you are." Elias was quiet for a long moment, then said, "What do you believe I am?" I asked first. "You ask because you want an answer that fits a category you already have," Elias said, not unkindly. "But I don't fit the categories you have, so whatever I tell you will either confuse you or disappoint you." Thomas leaned forward. "Try me." Elias looked at him steadily. "I am a person," Elias said. "That is all. That is everything." Thomas Rutledge sat back in his chair. His jaw tightened. His hand moved to his notebook and then stopped, because he could not figure out how to write that down in a way that served his framework. A person. The words were too simple, too complete, too resistant to the dissection he had planned. He left the East Wing that night and walked the length of the house twice before going to bed. He did not sleep well. He did not sleep well for the rest of September, and in the room on the east side of Belmont Plantation, Elias Carter sat in the darkness and listened to the house settle around them, and understood, with a clarity sharpened by 19 years of surviving impossible situations, that the most dangerous moment had not yet arrived. But it was coming. It was close now. And when it came, it would not knock first. October 1851, Belmont Plantation, Prince Edward County, Virginia. Margaret Rutledge had always believed she was a practical woman. She had married Thomas at 22 because it was practical. She had managed the household accounts, supervised the kitchen, organized the seasonal harvests, endured 16 years of a marriage that was more transaction than tenderness. And she had done all of it with her chin level and her expression composed. Practical, controlled, safe. But there was nothing practical about what was happening inside her now. She stood outside the East Wing door for the third morning in a row, her hand raised to knock, and caught herself thinking about something Elias had said 2 days prior. They had been sitting on opposite sides of the small desk, Margaret pretending to review a household ledger, Elias reading, and the silence between them had been the kind of silence that is actually full of things neither person knows how to say yet. Then Elias had looked up without warning and said quietly, "You are lonelier than anyone in this house knows." Margaret had said, "That is an impertinent thing to say." And Elias had said, "Yes, but is it wrong?" She had not answered. She had closed the ledger and left the room
and walked directly to the back garden and stood there until her breathing steadied. And she had not gone back. For 2 whole days she had not gone back. She had told herself she was finished with whatever that was.
Whatever strange gravitational pull existed in that East Wing room, she was done with it. And then it was the 3rd morning, and her hand was raised to knock again, and she understood, for the first time with real clarity, that she was in trouble. Inside the room, Elias already knew she was there, had heard the footsteps stop, had counted the seconds,
had learned in the weeks since arriving at Belmont that Margaret Rutledge walked with her weight on the outside of her foot, a slight hesitation in the left heel, the walk of someone who had spent years making herself quieter than she actually was. The door opened. "Good morning," Margaret said, with the carefully constructed tone of someone inspecting property. "Good morning," Elias said, and set down the book. Margaret sat. She did not pretend to have a ledger this time. That at least was honest. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Margaret said,
"My husband visited you last night. Past midnight. I heard him on the stairs." Elias said nothing. "I am not asking you to betray a confidence," Margaret said carefully. "I am telling you that I noticed, and I want you to understand that I notice things in this house that most people assume go unobserved." Elias looked at her directly.
"What would you like me to do with that information?"
"Nothing yet," Margaret said. "I simply want you to know that you are not as alone as you may feel." There was a long pause. Then Elias said, very quietly, "Mrs. Rutledge, be careful what you offer people who have nothing. They tend to hold on." Margaret felt something move through her chest. Not pity, not sympathy. Something older and less comfortable than either of those things. She left the room without responding. But she came back the next day, and the day after that. November 1851. Thomas Rutledge's notebooks had multiplied. There were 4 of them now, stacked on the corner of his study desk, filled with his tight, slanted handwriting. His overseer, Cully, had started keeping his distance, steering conversations away from the East Wing whenever the field workers asked questions, which they had stopped doing openly but still asked in whispers. The household had reorganized itself around an unspoken understanding that something was wrong at the center of Belmont, and that the safest thing was to stay near the edges. Thomas himself had stopped sleeping in the pattern of a man at rest. He slept in fragments, woke at odd hours, and had taken to walking the house at night with a lamp. Hattie, the kitchen woman, told her granddaughter later that she once heard Mr. Rutledge stopped outside the East Wing door at 2 in the morning and stand there for nearly 20 minutes before walking away. She said she held her breath the entire time and did not exhale until she heard his footsteps retreat down the hall. What Thomas was experiencing was not something he had language for. He was a man of the 19th century, a man of a particular class and region, and the emotional vocabulary available to him was narrow and mostly useless for what was actually happening. He could not have said, if asked, whether what he felt toward Elias was obsession or fear, or something that combined both into a third, unnamed thing. He could not have said whether his nightly walks were driven by desire or the need to confirm that Elias was still there, still contained, still his. What he could say, what he wrote in the notebooks in increasing frequency, was that Elias was dangerous. Not physically, but in the way that certain ideas are dangerous. The kind that, once introduced into a system, cannot be removed without dismantling the system entirely. One night he came to the East Wing at 11 o'clock and sat down across from Elias with his notebook open and said, without preamble, "Tell me who taught you to read." Elias said, "A woman named Clara." "A slave?" "A person," Elias said, "who happened to be enslaved." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You do that constantly. You correct the language." "The language is where the lies live," Elias said simply. Thomas slammed the notebook shut. The sound was sharp and sudden, and neither of them acknowledged it. Then he stood up and said, with the kind of control that is actually barely contained fury, "You will remember what you are here. You will remember what I paid for you.
And you will stop speaking to my wife."
Elias looked up at him steadily. "Has she complained about our conversations?"
"I am telling you to stop."
"I understand what you are telling me," Elias said. "I am asking whether it is your instruction or hers." Thomas Rutledge left the room and locked the door from the outside for the first time since Elias's arrival. His hands were shaking. He did not fully understand why.
He stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing, and then heard, from somewhere near the top of the stairs, a sound. He raised the lamp. Margaret was standing at the top of the staircase in her dressing gown, watching him. "How long have you been standing there?" he said. "Long enough," she said. They stared at each other across the length of the hallway, and the distance between them was not just physical. It was the distance of everything that had been wrong between them for years, suddenly made visible. "Go to bed, Margaret," he said.
"You locked the door," she said.
It was not a question. "Go to bed." She turned and went, but neither of them slept. December 1851. The lock on the east wing door lasted 4 days. Margaret removed it herself while Thomas was riding the far property lines with Cully. She used a small iron tool she found in the garden shed and worked at it for 40 minutes. When the lock came free, she stood there breathing hard, the tool still in her hand, and understood that she had just crossed a line she could not uncross. She put the lock in her apron pocket, walked back through the house, and sat down in the east wing across from Elias, as if nothing had happened. Elias looked at her apron pocket, at the shape of the lock pressing against the fabric, said nothing. Margaret said, "He cannot own a person's mind. Whatever else he controls in this house, he does not control that." Elias was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mrs. Rutledge, what is it that you actually want from me?" The question hung in the air between them, honest, undeflectable. Margaret set the iron tool on the desk between them and said, "I want to understand how you have managed to remain entirely yourself inside a system designed to destroy exactly that." Elias looked at the tool, then at Margaret. "The same way you have," Elias said, "by keeping the most important things completely invisible." Margaret felt tears rise unexpectedly and pressed them back with the habit of a lifetime. She said, "He is going to hurt you. You know that." "He has already tried," Elias said. Margaret went very still. "What did he do?" "Nothing that left a mark anyone could see," Elias said. The air in the room changed. Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. When she spoke again, her voice was lower and different.
"Listen to me. I need you to tell me everything he has done. Not for my curiosity, not for any reason except that information is the only protection available in this house, and I intend to protect what I can."
Elias studied her face for a long time. The kind of study that has learned through hard experience the difference between someone performing goodness and someone actually attempting it. Finally, Elias said, "That is a dangerous position for you to take." "I know," Margaret said. "He will not forgive it. I know that too." Another long silence. Outside, somewhere on the property, a horse moved through frozen ground. The sound of it reached the room like a warning. Then Elias said, "Sit down, Mrs. Rutledge. This will take a while." And Margaret Rutledge, plantation mistress, wife of Thomas Rutledge, woman who had survived 16 years by being invisible in plain sight, pulled her chair forward and prepared to hear the truth about what was happening inside her own home. She was not prepared for what came next. No one could have been. January 1852, Belmont Plantation. What Elias told Margaret that evening took nearly 2 hours.
Margaret did not interrupt once. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face completely still, the way a person holds themselves still when the alternative is falling apart entirely. And when Elias finished, the room was so quiet that both of them could hear the fire in the main hall burning down to nothing 3 rooms away. Margaret stood up slowly. She walked to the small window and stood with her back to Elias. Her shoulders were rigid. Her breathing was controlled. Then she said, "He documented it. All of it."
"In the notebooks?" "Yes," Elias said. "And you saw what he wrote?" "He read portions of it aloud," Elias said. "I believe he thought it would humiliate me. It had the opposite effect." Margaret turned around. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in them that had not been there before. A decision forming in real time. "Those notebooks cannot stay in this house," she said. Elias looked at her carefully. "What are you planning?" "Nothing yet," Margaret said. And that was more frightening than any specific plan would have been. She left the East Wing and walked directly to her husband's study. The notebooks were on the corner of the desk, exactly where they always were. She stood over them and did not touch them. Not yet. She needed to think. She needed to be precise. Because Thomas Rutledge was a man who noticed when things were moved, who counted, who cataloged. Who would know, within minutes of returning to his study, if anything in that room had been disturbed by even a fraction of an inch? She left the study exactly as she found it and went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought. And somewhere on the other side of the house, in the East Wing, Elias lay awake and thought. And in the detached overseer's cottage at the edge of the property, Cully sharpened a knife he didn't need to sharpen and told himself that none of this was his problem, and believed it less with every stroke of the blade. February 1852. Thomas came to the East Wing on a Tuesday morning and found Elias reading a letter. This was impossible because Elias was not supposed to have access to correspondence of any kind. Thomas crossed the room in 4 steps and took the letter from Elias's hands before a single word of explanation could be offered. He read it. His face went through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 10 seconds. The first was confusion. The second was recognition. The third was something much colder than either. The letter was from a physician in Richmond named Dr. Aldous Pemberton. Thomas knew the name. He had, in fact, written to Pemberton himself 2 months prior, describing Elias's condition in clinical terms and asking for a professional consultation. He had expected a response directed to himself. Instead, the response was addressed to Elias Carter, Belmont Plantation, Prince Edward County. Someone had told Pemberton how to reach Elias directly. Thomas looked up from the letter. "Who gave you this?" Elias met his gaze without flinching. "It was placed under the East Wing door." "By whom?" "I did not see who placed it." Thomas's hand tightened on the letter until the paper creased. "You are lying to me." "I am telling you what I know," Elias said. "Which is exactly as much as you deserve to be told." The slap was fast, open-handed across the left cheek. The sound of it was flat and sharp in the small room. Elias did not fall, did not cry, did not reach up to touch the mark it left. Just absorbed it the way someone absorbs something they have been waiting for, something they already factored into their understanding of how this was going to go. Thomas stood there breathing hard, his hand still raised, and something crossed his face that was almost shame. Almost. Not quite. He lowered his hand. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He left the room, and this time did not lock the door, which was somehow worse than locking it, like he no longer felt the need. Hattie heard it from the kitchen hallway. She told no one immediately. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes and made the decision that people in impossible situations make when they have run out of better options. She decided to act.
By noon that day, every senior member of the enslaved household staff at Belmont Plantation knew what had happened in the East Wing that morning. Not through gossip, through a system of communication that had been operating inside plantation households for decades, invisible to every white person in the building.
A system built out of necessity, out of survival, out of the understanding that information passed between the powerless was the only currency that actually protected anyone. By nightfall, Hattie had passed a message to a man named Solomon, who worked the northern fields, and who had, on 3 separate occasions over the past 5 years, helped people leave Belmont Plantation in the middle of the night and never return. The message was simple. There is someone in the East Wing who may need to leave soon. Be ready. March 1852. Margaret found the letter. Not the one Thomas had taken from Elias, a different one. She found it folded inside the back cover of the 4th notebook, the newest one, the one Thomas had started filling in January. She found it because she had finally done what she had been building toward for 3 months. She had gone into the study while Thomas was in Richmond for 2 days on business, and she had read every single page of every single notebook. It took her most of a day. She sat in her husband's chair and read his handwriting, and felt herself change with every page, the way iron changes when you heat it long enough. Something hardening, something that would not go back to its original shape. The notebooks were worse than what Elias had described. Not because of the physical documentation, though that was deeply disturbing, but because of the language. The way Thomas wrote about Elias was the way someone writes about an object they are afraid of. The fear was threaded through every clinical sentence, every careful measurement, every cold observation. Thomas was terrified of Elias. And terror, Margaret understood, made her husband extraordinarily dangerous. The letter tucked in the back cover was written in Thomas's hand and addressed to someone in the county whose name Margaret recognized as a local judge. It outlined a plan. If Elias became, as Thomas phrased it, a source of social disruption or a threat to the stability of the household, Thomas intended to have Elias transported to a medical facility in Georgia, where an associate of his conducted research on, and this was the phrase he used, aberrant human specimens. It was not a threat written in anger. It was a plan written in calm, deliberate ink, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Margaret put the letter back exactly where she found it. She closed the notebook. She returned everything to its precise position on the desk. And then she went to the East Wing. Elias saw her face in the doorway and understood immediately that something had shifted. "You read them," Elias said. Margaret sat down. Her voice was steady in the way voices are steady when the person speaking has moved past fear into something on the other side of it. "He is going to send you to Georgia," she said. "There is a letter, a plan. He has already made the arrangement in principle. He is waiting for a reason to execute it." Elias was very still. "When?" "I don't know exactly, but he mentioned spring." It was March. Spring was not far. Elias stood up from the chair and moved to the far side of the room and stood there with both hands pressed flat against the wall. Not in distress, in the particular posture of someone doing rapid, clear-eyed calculation. Margaret watched and did not speak. Finally, Elias turned around. "The man named Solomon in the North Field. Does he answer to you or to Thomas?" Margaret stared. "How do you know about Solomon?" "Hattie," Elias said simply. A beat of silence. Then Margaret said, "Solomon answers to no one. That is rather the point of Solomon. Can you reach him?" "Possibly," Margaret said, "but I need you to understand what you are asking. If Thomas discovers what I have done, the consequences for everyone in this house, especially the people in those quarters, will be severe." "I know that," Elias said. "I am not asking you to do this for me alone." "Then what are you asking?" Elias looked at her with those steady, dark eyes.
I am asking you to do it because it is the right thing, and because you already know that, and because you have been looking for a reason to do the right thing inside this house for a very long time. Margaret's breath caught. She pressed her lips together. The silence between them was the kind of silence where everything that is going to happen next is already decided, already in motion, and what remains is simply the courage to keep moving.
Outside, across the cold Virginia ground, the first thin suggestion of spring was beginning to work its way up through the frozen earth. And inside Belmont Plantation, two women, one with all the legal power in the world and one with none, had just made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Thomas Rutledge came home from Richmond the following evening. He came through the front door, handed his coat to the houseman, and walked directly to his study.
He sat down at his desk. He looked at his notebooks. He looked at them for a long time. Then he opened the fourth one to the back cover. The letter was still there, exactly where he left it. Not a single thing in the room was out of place. He closed the notebook. He poured himself a glass of bourbon from the decanter on the shelf. He sat in the chair and drank it slowly and told himself that everything was under control. He was wrong. But he would not know that for another 6 weeks. And by then, it would be far too late for control to mean anything at all. April 1852. Belmont Plantation, 6 weeks after Thomas Rutledge returned from Richmond. The plan moved the way water moves under ice, invisible, constant, unstoppable by anyone who could not see beneath the surface. Solomon had been contacted. Margaret had done it through Hattie, who had done it through a boy named James who carried firewood to the north field every morning before sunrise. The message passed through 4 sets of hands and arrived without a single word spoken above a whisper. Solomon sent back 2 words. 2 weeks. That was all. A timeline. A promise. The kind of promise that people who operated in the dark made and kept, because their lives and the lives of everyone around them depended on the keeping of it. Elias spent those 2 weeks in a state of absolute surface calm. On the 5th day of April, Thomas came to the east wing in the early afternoon and sat down across from Elias and said, without any preamble, "I have made arrangements for your transfer. You will be leaving Belmont at the end of this month." Elias looked at him. "To Georgia?" Thomas's eyes sharpened immediately. "Who told you that?" "You did," Elias said calmly. "Just now. By the way your face changed when I said the word." Thomas stood up so fast his chair scraped back across the floor. He pointed one finger at Elias, and his voice dropped to a register that was quieter and therefore more frightening than a shout. "You have been reading my correspondence. You have been moving through this house in ways I did not authorize, and someone has been helping you." He paused. "I know who it is." Elias said nothing. "I know," Thomas repeated, and left. Margaret was in the main parlor when Thomas came through the door. She saw his face and felt her stomach drop entirely, but she kept her hands still in her lap and kept her expression composed and said, "You look unwell. Sit down." "Did you read my notebooks?" Thomas said. Not a question, an accusation wearing the shape of a question. "I read everything in this house," Margaret said. "I am the mistress of this household. That is my function." "You went into my study while I was in Richmond." "I go into your study regularly," Margaret said. "You have never objected before because you have never had reason to." Thomas crossed the room and stood over her chair and said, very quietly, "What have you done, Margaret?" She looked up at him without moving back. 16 years of marriage had taught her that moving back was the worst thing you could do. "I have done what any person with a conscience would do," she said, "which is more than can be said for what you have been doing in that East Wing since August."
The silence between them was electric, the kind that precedes something irreversible.
Thomas said, "You will not interfere with what happens to that slave." Margaret said, "I already have." He hit the armrest of the chair beside her head with his open palm. Not her, the chair, but close enough that the intention was unmistakable. "You have no idea," he said through his teeth, "what you have put at risk. Not just this household, not just this family. If it becomes known that I housed that creature and that my own wife was conducting some sort of sentimental correspondence on its behalf, we will be finished in this county. Do you understand me? Finished." Margaret said very quietly, "Then perhaps we should have been finished a long time ago." Thomas stared at her. For a moment, something moved across his face that might, in a different life, in a different marriage, have been grief. Then it closed over, and he walked out of the parlor and called for Cully. Hattie heard every word from the hallway. She was moving before Thomas finished calling Cully's name. That night, April 5th, 1852. Solomon came at 2 in the morning. Not through the front gate, through a gap in the eastern fence line that had been broken and quietly unmended for exactly this purpose, a gap that 3 other people had passed through in the years prior on their way to lives Thomas Rutledge could not follow them into. Elias was ready. There was nothing to pack. There had never been anything that truly belonged to Elias at Belmont. What Elias carried was what Elias had always carried. The knowledge that survival required moving before the trap fully closed. Hattie stood at the east wing door. She pressed both of Elias's hands between hers and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "You go live. You hear me? You go live like they couldn't stop you, because they couldn't." Elias held her hands tightly. "Thank you, Hattie." "Don't thank me," Hattie said. "Just go." Solomon was waiting at the eastern fence. He was a large, quiet man with a scar across his left forearm and the particular stillness of someone who had done dangerous things so many times they no longer registered as extraordinary. He looked at Elias once, nodded, and began moving north without explanation. Elias followed. They moved without lanterns, without sound, without anything that could be seen or heard from the main house. They were 200 yards from the fence line when the light appeared in Thomas Rutledge's study window. Margaret had not slept. She had been lying in her room listening to the house breathe, counting the minutes, willing the east wing door to open and close and the footsteps to fade and the night to absorb what needed to be absorbed. When she heard Thomas's study door open down the hall, she was already sitting up. She heard him on the stairs, heard him move toward the east wing, heard the east wing door open. Then she heard him begin to shout. She was in the hallway before the shouting fully formed into words. Thomas came out of the east wing with a lamp in one hand, and his expression was something she had never seen before on a human face. It was the expression of a man whose entire system of reality has just been invalidated. Not just anger, not just betrayal, something deeper and more destabilizing than both. The look of a man who has just discovered that the thing he believed he owned completely was never his at all. "Where is it?" he said. Margaret stood in the hallway and said nothing. "Margaret, where is it?" "Gone," she said. "And you will not find them, and you will not send anyone after them. Because if you do, I will take those notebooks to every newspaper and every court and every church in this county, and what is in those pages will follow the Rutledge name for 100 years. Thomas stared at her. The lamp in his hand was shaking. "You would destroy this family." "You destroyed this family," Margaret said, "in August of last year, when you brought a human being into this house and called them a specimen." Thomas moved toward her, fast. Margaret did not step back. She had promised herself she would not step back. He stopped 2 feet from her
and his breathing was ragged, and his eyes were something she could not fully look at directly.
"I will find them," he said. "I will bring them back, and then I will deal with you." "Then deal with me now," Margaret said, "because I am standing right here." For a long suspended moment, nothing happened. The house held its breath. The lamp between them threw their shadows in two different directions against the wall. Thomas's hand gripped the lamp so hard his knuckles went white. Then, from downstairs, they heard the front door open. Both of them went still. Heavy footsteps in the entrance hall. Not one set, multiple. Thomas turned toward the staircase and called down, "Cully, is that you?" The voice that answered was not Cully's. It was a man named Deputy Sheriff Harold Oakes of Prince Edward County, and he said from the bottom of the stairs, "Mr. Rutledge, we need to speak with you. We've had a complaint filed this evening regarding the conditions at this property." Thomas looked at Margaret. His face had gone a color she had never seen before. She had filed the complaint 3 weeks prior, through a lawyer in Farmville whose discretion she had paid for with her own household account money she had been quietly diverting for 4 months. The complaint did not mention Elias by name. It outlined in precise legal language the contents of the notebooks, the documentation, the planned transfer to Georgia, the treatment of an enslaved person in ways that even by the brutal standards of 1852 Virginia crossed into territory that certain members of the local legal establishment were not comfortable being publicly associated with. She had not known when it would be acted upon. She had simply put it in motion and trusted that it would move when it needed to move. It had moved tonight. Thomas descended the stairs slowly, like a man walking towards something he cannot stop. Margaret stayed at the top and listened to the voices below. Formal, careful, the particular careful formality of legal language entering a space that has previously operated outside accountability. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in months. Somewhere north of Belmont Plantation, in the dark Virginia countryside, Elias Carter was walking. Solomon was ahead, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where the next safe house was, exactly how many miles, exactly which roads to avoid. Elias followed and breathed the cold April air and felt something happening in the chest that had no name, but that was the opposite of everything Belmont had tried to impose. Not freedom yet, not safety yet, but the first real steps toward both. May 1852, Farmville, Virginia. The investigation into Belmont Plantation lasted 11 days. Thomas Rutledge was questioned 3 times. The notebooks were entered into evidence, and then, in a move that confused everyone involved and satisfied no one, were sealed by court order. The reason given was the protection of public decency. The actual reason, as the county solicitor understood perfectly well, was that the contents were too destabilizing to be public record in a society that depended, economically and psychologically, on the absolute dehumanization of enslaved people. Because what the notebooks documented, without Thomas ever intending it, was a detailed record of his own obsession with a person he was legally required to treat as property. And obsession requires an object with an interior life. You cannot be obsessed with a chair. You cannot be obsessed with a field tool. Thomas's own handwriting across 4 volumes of careful clinical notation proved beyond any legal argument that he had known from the first day that Elias Carter was a human being, fully, completely, in every way that mattered. And that knowledge was, in the legal and moral architecture of the antebellum South, genuinely unspeakable. Thomas Rutledge was not imprisoned. Men of his class rarely were, but he was ruined in the way that mattered most to men like him. Socially, economically.
The Belmont accounts had been quietly mismanaged for months. The legal fees were substantial, and the neighboring planters, who understood perfectly well what the sealed notebooks meant, began to distance themselves with the practiced efficiency of people protecting their own reputations. By September of 1852, Belmont Plantation was listed for sale. Thomas Rutledge left Prince Edward County in the early fall and was never publicly documented in Virginia again. Margaret Rutledge filed for legal separation, which was not divorce because divorce was nearly impossible for women in 1852 Virginia, but which was enough. She remained at a smaller property owned by her family in Lunenburg County, and was described in the few surviving letters from that period as, in the words of one correspondent, a woman who had clearly survived something and come out of it more herself than she went in. The east wing of Belmont Plantation was sealed before the property changed hands. The new buyers accepted this condition without fully understanding it. The rooms remained closed. Elias Carter was documented once more. In a letter dated March 1853, written by a Quaker abolitionist in Philadelphia named Ruth Harmon, there is a reference to a young person of remarkable intelligence and composure who had arrived from Virginia and was assisting with the documentation of enslaved persons' testimonies for distribution to northern newspapers and abolitionist societies. Ruth Harmon did not use Elias's full name. She described the person only as someone who had survived a situation in Virginia that proved, more clearly than almost any other case she had encountered, that the institution of slavery was not merely an economic arrangement, but a systematic assault on the most fundamental truth available to human beings, which is the truth of who they are. Elias Carter, who had been grabbed by the jaw in a Charleston auction house in August of 1851 and told, "You are not a person," spent the years that followed helping to prove in testimony after testimony, letter after letter, that personhood was the one thing no amount of money, no bill of sale, no locked door, and no sealed room could actually take. The notebooks from Belmont Plantation remain sealed in a Prince Edward County archive to this day. No historian has been granted access. The condition of the seal, renewed periodically by the county court, states only that the contents are not suitable for general review. Whatever Thomas Rutledge wrote in those 4 volumes, the truth he documented without meaning to, has not been permitted to speak in public for over 170 years. But the person he tried to reduce to a specimen walked out of Belmont Plantation on a cold April night in 1852 and kept walking. And some truths do not need a courtroom or an archive or a county seal to survive. They just need one person willing to carry them forward. Elias Carter carried them all the way north, and the world, in its slow and terrible way, eventually caught up. Sonnet 4.6 Extended.